Welcome to the Moulding Health Show. Our goal is to leverage the wisdom and experience of healthcare practitioners to set you on a path of self-discovery and healing. These insights, coupled with a multidisciplinary approach to each area of interest, should provide an invaluable resource to everyone looking for a better approach to health. In this episode, we speak to Leanda Otto about concessions and accommodations from an educational psychologist perspective. Leanda Otto, welcome to the show. So we're really glad to have you on board and speaking to you about concessions from an educational psychologist point of view. Welcome on board.
Thank you so much. It's awesome to be with you guys today. And I think it's such a great topic to talk about. I think it's something that in the past, we never spoke about a lot, and it's quite new to a lot of people. So I think it's amazing to explore the topic and to get a bit of guidance and just some new ideas around the topic. So thanks for having me.
Sure, you're very welcome. And I always ask Shaz this because, I'm obviously not in charge of the scheduling, but Shaz, how did you even find Leanda?
Well, to be perfectly frank, my nieces were both in school in Alberton and had gone to see an educational psychologist. And when I was looking for somebody to chat to about concessions, I kind of started going, okay, well, who did my nieces see? And eventually I just phoned my mom and I'm like, do you remember who they saw? And she said, no, but it starts with an L. So I took to Facebook, and Leanda's Facebook page popped up, and it's one of the few from a ed psych perspective that's regularly got good content on. So I reached out, and Leanda came back and said she would be really keen to chat to us, and that's kind of where we went.
That's great to hear the positive feedback from the page. So thanks for that as well.
I love those stories because, Shaz has got some amazing guests on. This one included as well. But, and it's interesting how the story is, that's the first time I heard that. But what's nice about that, Leanda, is that it shows you the longevity of your practice. From Shaz's nieces, and you would have never, that's the amazing thing with life, eh? It's like you never put some of these pieces together and it just kind of like seems to work. But yeah, I would have never guessed that. That's actually a really cool story, Shaz.
Yeah.
So on concessions, I want to ask you firstly, what is concessions, so that we get that one kind of very clear, so everyone is, understands that. And then, just to say, I didn't think it's as big, but, obviously, from a specialization point of view, you spent a lot of time with this topic, but maybe just kick it off and tell us, what is concessions?
Sure. So concessions, we also have another label that we use for it, and it's called accommodations. And I think it explains it so well, is that concessions or accommodations, whichever way you want to call it, really accommodates a student to utilize their potential and their skills and their knowledge. So concessions was put in place because the Department of Education identified that there are a lot of learners that have got learning barriers or things in their life, whether it's a learning barrier or a learning disorder, whatever the case might be, that causes challenges for them when they're writing formal tests and exams. Have it be anxiety, severe anxiety, have it been a dyslexia or dysgraphia or an ADHD or whatever it might be, and that these learners often don't really cope well in a formal testing environment due to the challenges that they have. So they have the knowledge and they have the cognitive ability and they have the potential, but it's literally putting that on paper. So for some learners, it might be that they just need a little bit of extra time to be able to complete because they read slower or they write slower or they need to type their question paper, their answers, because their handwriting is really, really difficult to read. So I think the one thing to be very clear of is that a concession can be put in place not to give a child an advantage. And that's the biggest thing that we look at, is that when a concession is put in place or an accommodation, concession is that it's not going to give a child an advantage above another child. So it's literally to give them a fair chance to be able to utilize their potential. So that in essence is what a concession is. So a formal concession comes in when there's a formal assessment, a test or an exam. And then we also have a more informal concession or accommodation, which are classroom concessions. And those are internal concessions. So those would be where the schools basically in the classroom put accommodations in place, like a child that maybe needs to, instead of sitting and working all the time, can stand with a desk stand, or a child can have a magnifying glass, or a child can sit on a ball, or a child needs a weighted blanket, those kind of things. So we often find that in the different schooling systems, so for example, with your mainstream schools, internal accommodations are at times more difficult to facilitate. When you have 40 kids in a class, there's no space necessarily for enough kids to sit on the balls and those kind of things. And then also when you look into remedial, so that's often where a lot of the kids would move into remedial because the classrooms are smaller, the teachers are a bit more equipped and trained in the internal accommodations. So that's just in a nutshell what concessions are on a formal level, and then obviously internal in a classroom setting.
That's actually nicely explained to us. I mean, I can't help to think, but then you kind of dispelled that because you said unfair advantage. And I was like, I wish there were concessions when I was like doing exams, that would be amazing. But obviously that's not the case. That's not the purpose. But I do have to ask, so how would someone qualify for a concession, especially based on the unfair advantage aspect?
Yeah, so there's standard protocols and procedures that have been put in place. So it is a requirement that every child that if the need is first identified, so that's the first step. So it could either be a teacher that says, you know what, I can see this child's got potential, the marks are not reflecting it, or they're not finishing their question papers, they're losing marks for spelling and reading. So they identify the need, or the parent might identify the need and say, well, my child is not coping in exams, and approaches the school. So normally the school would then recommend and say, have your child assessed. So the reason for that is not because they are not sure if the child needs it, or, because they want to follow a long process. It's actually protocol and procedure. So within the different schooling systems, we also have different protocols and procedures. So concessions is one of my passions and something that I love working with. And with the different systems of schooling, there's different protocols. So for example, your IEB curriculum, or your Cambridge curriculum, or your standard CAPS curriculum from the Department of Education, there's different policies. So each institution, academic institution, has got a policy. So that's the first point of call, is that we also need to then, so the parent would then need to find an educational psychologist, because that's the only person that can do these concessions assessments. It can't be a counselor or a teacher or any other type of psychologist. It has to be an educational psychologist, because we are trained in that. And then we do the assessment based on the policy. So the policy would stipulate and say, you need to do a full IQ assessment, you need to do a full academic assessment, you need to do a full emotional assessment. And that's something that we can maybe also chat about in terms of why it's important to assess all of these things. And based on that assessment, then we would be able to see if the child does qualify or not. So to answer your question in terms of, how does a child qualify for a concession, is that the report needs to prove that. So the assessment needs to prove. So the theory behind concessions and the policies that all the policies adhere to stipulates that a child needs to have the cognitive ability to cope with that specific curriculum. If they, for example, don't have the cognitive ability due to some sort of disability or a challenge, a concession is not going to necessarily assist them in performing better, if that makes sense. Then we need to look at a different schooling system for this child where they can flourish, because otherwise we're sitting with an individual that is maybe more technical and they are frustrated in the academic section, and the concession does not solve anything. So that's the first thing that we look at is your cognitive ability and your processing on the correct standard for that curriculum. And then secondly, academic assessment. So the academic assessment is there to see what you're reading, what you're spelling, what you're writing, what speed, and also in the different policies and the different curriculums, we do different types of assessments. So for example, with the IEB, they stipulate specific UK assessments that we have to use. For the South African ones, it's different. So every policy is different. And then also obviously emotional, to see, is there anything emotional, on emotional level that the child needs to have support with. Because concessions then obviously range from something like having extra time, sitting in a separate venue, having bathroom breaks, handwriting concessions, not being penalized as much for spelling, having a reader, having a scribe, having an oral assessment. So there's so many concessions. There's literally such a long list, being able to use a dictionary. And very, very seldomly are there exemptions of subjects. So we really try to stay clear from that. We want the children to have the full curriculum, but very, very few times do you encounter a child that really has a huge cognitive difficulty with maths or with a language or with something, and then we can apply for exemption, but that's very, very rare. We do try to rather put support in place to assist the child and put a concession in place than taking a subject away completely, because obviously that would have implications for studying later on when they want to go to university and all those kind of things. So that's how you qualify for a concession, is we have to see what type of concession you would qualify for and motivate why we feel that concession is going to support the child based on the evidence that we have found in the assessment.
That's actually so interesting. And this is probably a softer question though, but and maybe in a remedial setting, it's okay. But do you find like there's like stigma associated with it? Because I can just think, if I'm sitting and writing the exam and someone else gets, 15 minutes additional, do you find any of that? I don't know if you deal with that per se from an ed psych point of view, but do you find any of that?
Yes. So often, in therapy, because one of the other parts, one of our other portfolios or our roles, or however you want to label it, is therapy. So doing psychotherapy and doing play therapy, and often it does when a child's got a learning difficulty, not only do they have to deal with the stigma attached to it, you are the one that can't sit still, or you're the one that you're always talking, and now you also get extra time, that's unfair, so the stuff that they have to deal with often with bullying. But I must say, I think we are advocating it so well that I think it's becoming not more common, but more prevalent. And a lot of kids are actually needing concessions. And maybe that's a different point to discuss in terms of, but why are concessions now all of a sudden, needed? And why is it so, almost some parents would say it's like it's the talk of the town now, everyone needs a concession. But it's really very few kids that really need concessions, but they do. So I think the positive thing about it becoming more frequent and people are more educated about it is that the stigma is kind of fading a little bit. There was a stage where I thought it was a bit of a trend, because all of a sudden we had all the matrics applying for extra time and for extra support in terms of concessions. And then it's very clear cut that if you don't have evidence to support that you would need it and the motivation is not strong enough, you're not going to get the concession. So I must say the education board that governs all the curriculums are very strict. They will not give a concession if it's really not necessary. So I think in that we can rest assured that it is very well regulated from my point of view. And then it is really something that you can only get when you definitely need it. So the kids don't have an unfair advantage. What I've seen some schools do is that they would, for example, all the kids with extra time, put them in a separate venue so that it doesn't disturb the other kids as well. So that often works well. And I think sometimes we underestimate the culture of acceptance in our schools, because for a lot of kids, sometimes it's more the parents or more the teachers or more someone else that says, oh, why is that person getting extra time? And then the kids would say to me in therapy, because they write slower or because they read a little bit slower, and that's fine, So I think that kids are a lot more accepting if they are propagated and if they are guided, in a positive way.
Yeah. There's a few things I like that you said there, Leanda. The first one being obviously that there isn't an unfair advantage, but I really like the fact that you guys try as much as you can to avoid a subject exemption. And so when I think back to my schooling, I was educated in Zim, so very much a Oxford, Cambridge schooling system. So we were streamed, the A stream, B stream, C stream kids. And it was, once you reached high school, it was very simply a case of if you were in A stream, you were going to get to your final exams a year before the guys in B stream.
Sure.
But your B stream kids were never going to qualify for upper or lower six. They were going to write their O levels and that was it. A stream, you were going to get to write your A levels. But the stream that always intrigued me was the C stream, because you saw them in English, but you never saw the C stream kids in any of the other academic subjects. And again, I suppose in some way that might have also been almost a concession. They're not academically inclined, but these were the kids that were in art, technical drawing, woodwork, so far more technical. But yeah, I must admit, I agree with Oliver's point that a concession would have been really great when I was in school, because I skated through on what I did throughout the year. My year-end exams was just always and then what happened? Well, I got the yips. So, but I think the fact that it is very regulated does take away just that thought that, somebody is getting an additional advantage. So as a teacher, what kind of things would a teacher be on the lookout for to almost start thinking, okay, maybe I should recommend an assessment with an educational psychologist looking at a student?
So I think there's two different areas. The one would be when it's an emergency concession. So an emergency concession is something that's obviously an emergency. Something happened now. It's an emergency. So for example, child breaks his arm. He needs to write his exams tomorrow. What are we doing? He might have studied. He knows his work. So instead of giving the class average to the child, we give them the opportunity and we give an emergency oral concession. So that is done directly with the Department of Education, and we send through the documentation, and it's sorted. So obviously, if the evidence is there and it's validated. So that's the one part. Or someone has an emotional challenge. Someone in the family passes away, or someone falls very ill, and there's there's a child has a panic attack, and there's anxiety. So that could also then validate an emergency concession. So that's the one part of it. The other part, and I mean, that's quite clear to identify. There's an emergency. It's, that's where I always urge parents to be open and honest, to the teachers and communicate with them, because if you sending a child in to write an exam, I've had a child come in for an IQ test and her grandmother passed away the night before, and there's no way that I can do that IQ test, So immediately, obviously, did not continue with it and rescheduled. But the same for an exam. So there are some things that we can obviously look at, but it cannot be minor things, of course. It's an emergency as an emergency. The second part is then obviously your longer concessions, which are normally granted for about 2 years. So the first thing we look at with concessions, let's say, for example, we look at high school kids, grade 10 to 12. We want to see, and the department always says, where is your trail of evidence? We want to see a trail of evidence. So meaning that you cannot in grade 12 all of a sudden now need a reading concession or now need a time concession if there hasn't been contributing factors. I have applied for grade 12s for the first time in their life and they have gotten it, but there were certain circumstances that validated it. So we also obviously try and identify it as early as possible. So we always say in foundation phase, when you go to grade 4 and you start with tests and exams, that's when you already start looking for these learners. In high school, sometimes it's more, it is easier to pick them up because now they've settled in and they're supposed to be used to the exams and the formal assessments. But what the teachers can look out for, first of all, when we're looking at time concessions, is the child finishing the question paper? Often, kids get these marks and they get a 70, but then there's a quarter of the page, of the question paper missing that they haven't done. So if this is a trend that's often happening in most of the subjects, or let's say at least 2 or 3 of the subjects, that's something that would then validate being assessed, because we need to identify, why are you not finishing? Is it because you're reading slower? Is it because you're writing slower? So we need to identify what type of concession would obviously be better. So that's the first thing. The second thing is spelling mistakes. I think in general, our children's spelling is atrocious. It's really hard because they write in shortened messages to each other. We've got all the, the abbreviations, the LOL and everything. So they don't write those words anymore. So I think spelling in general is not as great as it can be. But there's a difference between a spelling difficulty and a spelling disorder. Or a spelling barrier. So we need to identify, and that's why we do the assessment. So obviously, if spelling continuously with intervention does not improve, that's when it would validate being assessed. Also medical things. So any medical condition that a child might have. For example, I have a university student that's on concessions that gets very anxious, and she often needs to go to the bathroom to just give herself wash her face. And so she needs a bathroom concession, for example. So also emotional indicators can also be looked at. And then also often teachers would say, but they know the work orally, but as soon as they have to put it on paper, or the parents would say to me, when I tested them the night before, they knew the work, they could say it, even in the car, in the morning they could say it, but they cannot put it on paper. So it's almost that transition of putting it on paper. So that often is an indicator. So those are the things that we ask teachers to have a look at to see. So do they finish their work? Are they making lots of spelling errors? How is their reading? How is their working speed in class? Is it the child that you constantly need to say, come on, you need to sit in during break time and do your work, So there's a reason for that. There's no child that just sits and decides not to do their work for no reason. There's an indicator. There's always a reason to all behavior, whether it's emotional, whether it's behavioral, whether it's academic. So those are the things that they really need to look out for.
Spoken. I can see why you're an educational psychologist, and why kids have you on their side. But that's amazing. I wish I knew this. I mean, you say talk of the town, but I never came across it before. Shaz has another saying, obviously with kids and stuff like that, the whole Ritalin babies. But this is like another one of those things that you almost like, as a parent or a teacher, you almost like need to be aware of, so you can help children in the best way. I mean, I've got some horror stories, as in, like how children really struggled. A friend of mine was like so slow, but he was brilliant, like in every other setting, except when it came to schoolwork. And he was one of those ones that you mentioned, was always the last one to copy the notes. But, and it's funny, throughout our schooling career, he was always one of our friends. He never got bullied or anything for that. But he got more issues from the teachers than, his peers. And the teachers would always be, why are you so slow? Why are you doing this? And stuff like that, which was interesting. So it kind of collaborates your story in terms of that. And I wish we knew that for him. I don't know if it was available at that time. I'm hoping it was.
And I think with the labeling, like you said, and the stigma around it, is that we often forget that intelligent kids or intelligent people can also process slower. Often it is because their minds are so busy and they're thinking about so many things and they are thinking ahead of things, so often it's their processing can be slower. So I always say to parents that when your child needs a concession, it doesn't mean that there's, cognitively something impaired or there's something wrong. Often it's intelligent kids that also need concessions. So if there's not a severe learning barrier, but it's a processing thing, then it's because they are processing slower because they are very pedantic. Often it's also kids that are a little bit, very pedantic and want to do things right and want to get it right and want to reread the story 5 times before we answer the questions. So yes, that's when also concessions comes into place, but we also put intervention in place. So I think something that goes hand in hand with concessions is intervention. So for every challenge we pick up that we apply for a concession, we need to put intervention in place. So whether that be reading classes, spelling classes, writing classes, occupational therapy to, slow up working speed, whether it's language or speech therapy to improve and to speed up processing. But there's always an intervention, because at the end of the day, after your studies, and concessions, by the way, you can get throughout university as well. Concessions came in with the white paper 6 with inclusive education, which is part of universities as well. But after university, life, it does not have concessions. So we need to also put interventions in place. So what we find is that with the intervention, and that's why I always urge parents and say, great stuff, we got the concession, but we have to put the intervention in place. Obviously, the older we get, we learn to cope with these skills. I always joke and say, I have ADHD, what's your superpower? So we learn to utilize our greatest challenge can become our greatest strength. So the intervention is also extremely important. So I really urge parents to say, if there's a concessions, application and it's goes through, put the intervention in place to help your child so that when they are finished with university or their studies or whatever the case, in the world of work, they can learn the skills to adapt. And then we can see those improvements as well. So I think that's quite important.
Both Oliver and I are slightly geeks, but you are now about the 4th or 5th practitioner that has said the same thing. Your ADHD or your sensory integration or any of these can actually be seen as a child's superpower, because depending on what it is, it hyper-focuses them into that area. But more importantly, that idea of interventions, because you're right, once you leave school and you're out of that academic sector, you go into the office. And we were chatting to an occupational therapist who deals with sensory integration, and she was saying, it's great as a kid. You can say, okay, well, let them go into a tunnel. But they need to learn to cope, because when you go to the office, it's going to look really funny when your manager walks in and you're sitting in your cupboard.
Yes, yeah.
So, educational psychology obviously goes hand in hand with a lot of other therapies. So when looking at something like a concession, would you also then be consulting with a speech therapist or an occupational therapist to see, maybe it's just the kid needs a different pencil grip kind of thing?
Definitely. So often if we find that a child doesn't need a concession, but they just need intervention, or like I said, the concession and the intervention. So we definitely do. So we have good networking and good relationships, and we know which therapists specialize in what areas. For example, when you're looking at a language processing difficulty, parents would say, but my child doesn't need speech therapy. So then it's also about educating a parent and saying, okay, but a speech therapist doesn't only do speech therapy. They actually, the biggest core of their work is about processing of language and input and output. So also the education of parents, and with occupational therapy as well. You get certain occupational therapists that specialize in older children and some that specialize in younger children. So it's also important to know who to refer to. But we definitely, often if we need to substantiate to get a concession, we might say, please go to the speech therapist and do the language assessment, the processing assessment, so that we can support and use that evidence in our report as EdSci. Because ultimately, it's our report that gets handed in with any supporting documents. So any other reports, and it's like I said, it's a process. So there's a lot of application forms and all kinds of, we have to give samples of work. So I prepare like a little file for the school for the application, just makes their life so much easier. We put all the reports in there, all the application forms, all the supporting documents, and they literally hand that. The school then takes that and applies with the Department of Education.
That actually sounds really good. I do want to go to what are the specific concessions, because I think that would be interesting. I mean, I had a friend, and she had to apply for a scribe for a daughter. And that's the first time when I think scribe, I'm thinking, like medieval times. It was the first time I came across that term, but it's apparently a thing. So I would love to know what that is. But I want to tell you the story. So when we were at varsity, I had this friend, and he was doing actuarials. And, we talk about exam strategies. So with the actuarials, I mean, like the workload is quite hectic, and you have to get like above a certain mark. And so what he came up with was this system where you would always half write the exams, so you write the first two, then you would go get sick, right? And then obviously get concession for the other 2 exams or 3 exams, and then write that on the supplementaries. And he worked the system all the way to, fourth year, and it worked like a charm, eh? So almost like, like he had his own system about how to deal with exams, and it worked. And the first time I heard it, I was like, that's kind of crazy. Why would you want to give up your holidays? And he just said, no, but it gives me more time to study. And I thought that was brilliant,
Very
Too bad
strategic.
Yeah. Too bad I only learned it like probably by the third year. And I was too scared to use it. So I was like, what happens if they say no? Then,
Yeah, so if they figure out what your strategy is.
Exactly. But coming back to the concession types, so let's start with the scribe, because that one interested me. What others would there be? Well, starting with the scribe, obviously.
So a scribe is purely someone that scribes for you, that writes for you. So when you have a scribe, you read yourself, which means that your reading is up to standard, your reading is fine. So often a scribe is put in place for, like I said earlier on, for the learners who struggle to put their words in writing. So those are people that struggle with processing, that can verbalize it, but when they have to put it in a sentence, it's difficult. Or when they have to put it on paper, but they can verbalize themselves well. So that would be a scribe. So someone literally only writes for you. They're only allowed to write exactly what you say they need to write. When there's spelling components, they have to ask you to spell. So that's a scribe. A scribe is also then for example, if someone breaks their arm or they can't write, a scribe can also be for someone that's handwriting, that's got dysgraphia, that's got a very, very poor handwriting. You literally cannot make out anything. So you do need to get that. But what we're leaning more towards with that is to get children to work on computers then in the class, but also do their exams, because then at least, again, intervention. We're giving them a skill that they're going to use, because we do write. I still enjoy writing a lot on with pen and paper, but we are very digitalized. I mean, in the modern day, if a child can use a computer and type, it's way better than, if they can write. But those concessions only come. So another important factor is that concessions mainly are implemented from grade 4 upwards. So in the foundation phase, grade 1, 2, and 3, and grade R, that's now become part of foundation phase, is that we really want the children to write. We want them to develop those fine muscles. We want them to be able to engage with tactile pen and paper. So it's skills that they learn. It's got to do with the processing of the brain and the coordination between eye and hand and board. And so there's a lot of brain activity and development that happens in the foundation phase. So therefore, we only apply for concessions as far as possible from grade 4 onwards. Very rarely do I have concessions between grade 1 and grade 3. Sometimes grade 3, but then it has to be a severe learning difficulty. So it is severe dyslexia or a severe dysgraphia where they really need that. So scribe, someone writes for you. Okay. Then the other concessions, do you want me to run you through some of the other concessions as well?
So yeah, definitely. But I do want to ask, so, I mean, this is like a whole occupation in its own. So who could be a scribe? Because...
Yeah, like you say, it is an occupation on its own. So you need to have a qualification to do that. So it's a course. It's a very short course. Department of Education trains teachers in that. They train therapists in that. And any parent or any individual can be a scribe, but you need to do the training of that. So there's also, obviously, with the concessions, there's a very strict regulation process. So we sign a declaration with every single exam that you assist a child to say that you didn't cheat, you didn't answer for them. So it's a very regulated process, but anyone can. So any individual. It often, so depends on the school. If a school has got a therapist or auxiliary services or a therapist posts, then often the psychologists or the counselors or the OTs or the speeches, they would facilitate these concessions in the school if the school has got them available. If the school doesn't have them available, the second option is a trained teacher to do that. And if the school doesn't have trained teachers, then it's the parents that come in that they send for training. So it really depends on the system of the school. In some schools, they would, especially with the private ones or even government ones where they don't have people available, the child can have the concession, but then it's the responsibility of the parent to assist to arrange for a scribe or, for someone to do that. But most schools prefer to regulate that themselves, just because the people need training and they need to facilitate, the different classrooms or the different time zones or slots or whatever. So yeah, that's how that works.
That's so interesting, hey? So you can't nominate someone. You have to actually go through like someone gets formally appointed for you, which makes sense. I mean, I just thought that's weird. It didn't suit me. I don't know if you ever watched the series Suits, but the one attorney. He would write exams for other people.
Yes.
So you get, all you need to pass the exam is like this amazing scribe. Like
yes, and then you pass. Thank goodness it's regulated. But you do actually get a lot of old teachers that have retired or students. So students make wonderful scribes because they're very ethical and they want to, follow the rules and regulations, which is good because that's what we want. So they often go for these trainings, and then they can, so I almost want to say it's a new open market that hasn't been explored yet, because often it is the school that arranges, but there's a lot of possibilities where students that are still studying educational psychology can do the training and can actually offer their services to schools.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. I mean, I obviously, joked when I said it, but I mean, it is an occupation that I would have never thought, is even on the landscape, but it makes a lot of sense. I mean, students are always complaining that they don't have enough money, but this could be, one of those other avenues that they could actually generate additional income. Exactly. And it benefits, them and the students, which is amazing. Yeah. But take us through the other ones. So describe. I was interested in the dictionary one. There was that one.
Yeah. So the dictionary can also be useful often for children where it's maybe their fourth or their fifth or their sixth language. So then often a dictionary can be helpful. Also, when there's severe spelling difficulties or severe reading difficulties, sometimes they would allow the use of a dictionary. And obviously, there's a lot of different reasons that would validate that. So your most common ones are obviously the extra time. And that's allocated either 5, 10, or 15 minutes per hour. So that depends on the assessment. So, for example, if your assessment is 2 hours long and you qualified for 5 minutes per hour extra, you will get 10 minutes in total extra. If you qualified for 10 minutes per hour extra and your exam paper is 2 hours, you would have 20 minutes. If you have 15 minutes, and that's the maximum per hour, you can imagine if you are in grade 12 and you're writing a biology exam that's 3 hours long and you had 15 minutes qualification per hour, that's a 45 minutes extra that you can actually work and go through your exam, and it's a lot of time. So there's the different portions, and that's allocated based on the assessment. So we actually, as Ed Psychs, identify and say, this child needs 5 minutes per hour because X, Y, Z, or 10 or 15. So that's your extra time. Separate venue. So that would be for someone that struggles to focus, or someone that's maybe extremely anxious, or someone with a medical condition, or someone that needs a bathroom break, or if whatever is happening in their surroundings, someone with sensory processing disorder can also qualify for that. So it's a separate venue where they can really focus and work in a separate venue. So that'll be 2 different types of separate venue. The one is either you alone in a venue with your facilitator, or a separate venue for the 5 or 10 kids that have got a separate venue concession, if that makes sense. So instead of sitting in a big classroom, you either sit in a smaller group or you sit, by yourself. So you can imagine the arrangements that come with this. So for schools, it can be challenging because if you have 5 kids that need to sit in separate venues, you need 5 invigilators to watch these kids. So we're talking about manpower. We're talking about teaching staff that we know 90% of schools are understaffed. The classrooms are big. So it does cause a lot of, other complications. But then obviously we see how we can work with the school and with the parents to see how we can make this work. So it's definitely not undoable. what I'm just trying to say is that it's not just a quick thing that can be arranged. It's something that really needs planning. And that's why I always urge parents and say, do this in advance. When you book for a concessions assessment, know it's going to be a 3 to 4 month process where you're going to do the assessment, you're going to send in the application, you're going to get feedback, then we still need to do the arrangements. So that's why early identification is so important. In the beginning of the year, if you identify a child, have them assessed, and then by the middle of the year or by the second term when the exams come, they can already have this concession. So that will be time concessions, your venue concession, your separate venue, like I said, your scribe we spoke about, your reader. So your reader is exactly what it says. It's someone that literally reads the question paper to you as many times as you want them to. So they read, that's all they do for you. They don't write for you, they read for you, you write. That would be the scribe that does the writing. If you have an oral concession, you basically are answering the questions orally. So the oral concession would be that someone would read for you and do the writing for you. So it's an oral examination. So that's an oral. And then, like I said, the use of dictionary, the exemption of a subject, which is the one that I said we really, really do. We also get then the handwriting concession. So handwriting concession, meaning that they won't be penalized for their handwriting, but it's still readable. Then we also get a computer concession. That's what I said when you can't. So you, instead of then having someone write for you, having a scribe, you then type out your answers on a blank computer where there's no other programs. There's very strict regulations. So yeah, that's that one. And then which ones have I not covered? There's a couple others as well that's very, it's not very common that we use them. But also there's a other category. There's always an other category. So that could be any other type of concession, or the DSM ones that says unspecified. When you identify a need and there's some sort of concession. So for example, like sitting on a ball or standing and writing your assessment with a desk stand. So those would be the other concessions that we then also look at. And then I think I mentioned the spelling concession. So spelling concession, for example, when you are writing a transactional text or you are writing an essay, and in the rubric you can lose 5 marks for spelling, for example, one can apply that you lose a little bit less. So you basically only lose 2 marks, but the other 3 marks you don't lose. But then we obviously justify that you have a spelling disorder. So with intervention, your spelling is not going to improve as much as it should, if you didn't have the disorder. So yeah, those are the key concessions. And then, like I said, the other, that would be the concession that we then request for if there's high levels of anxiety and the child needs to have rest breaks. So rest breaks also is one of the concessions. Also bathroom breaks, breaks to take medication. So there's a lot of other types of concessions, but those are the main ones that we deal with every day.
I like that. And then, so if you had a scribe, would you then also apply for additional time? Because I can imagine that does take more time, though. And if you had to, if someone else had to write for you, does that come with additional time as well then?
Not necessarily. So sometimes it can go quicker depending on the subject and depending on how fast the scribe writes. So we're hoping that the scribe doesn't need a handwriting concession herself, right? So himself. So yes, that's going to be, it is a possibility to request the extra time. But we find that most of the scribes actually do it within the allocated time. If they are writing fast themselves, at a normal pace. So it can, but it would depend on the child. So for example, if the child has got slower processing and they have a scribe, I would apply for extra time as well, because they are processing a little bit slower and they have then the scribe. Yes.
Okay, nice. I think, what you said, around the 3 to 4 months and the planning, I think this is also a really good opportunity. What we want to get out of the show is that at least people know what to ask and they have some idea of what this is. And you're not like me that didn't know much about concessions. But then at least you know your own child and you know how you can almost help them. So you don't end up in grade 12 and then now you realize actually, because there's so much of of pressure, on the exam, that actually you do need more assistance. So I think hopefully that's what we get out of this, because it does take more time. And like you said, you almost need to build up that portfolio of evidence to help the child and to get that concession. Also liked what you said about the logistic part, because I think, if you come to grade 12, the examination papers only get opened at a certain time. So that must be quite a logistic issue, to be able to get all of that stuff organized in the right way. And then I liked what you said about spelling, and I have to ask, so almost like getting your brain on it. So we've got 2 kids, and their spelling is terrible too. So like, do you have like any techniques or things that you help them? I mean, it's not terrible, but I think all kids struggle with spelling. Are there certain exercises or things like that you recommend to children?
To support the spelling. So I think it depends on the severity of the spelling challenge. So when it's quite severe, then we normally refer to a language or speech therapist to assist with that, because we need to identify what is the cause of the spelling challenge. Is it because there's sound differentiation problems, or is it that they purely just don't spell because they don't write the words? Then we know that it's something that we need to practice. Or is it because of the processing of the sound? So there's so many different things: sound differentiation, language processing difficulties, or is it a visual difficulty? Is it that they need glasses, that they're struggling to actually see the words? So I think the first point of call is to identify what is the root cause of the spelling difficulty, and that we obviously do through assessment, or as parents, if you can pick it up and you're a little bit skilled in the area, you'll be able to see, is it necessary for an assessment or not? So that would be the first thing, is to identify the root cause of it, because the intervention will be different. So in general, kind of like general tips for improving spelling, I always say to parents, use the gifts that you get from your kids, like the technology, use the App Store or Google Play Store and go and download spelling apps. Kids want to be on their iPads, or they want to be on their devices. So, bring it in. There's amazing apps that I'm happy to share with you guys as well, that you can download for spelling, for improving your spelling, for improving your reading. So utilize technology. Obviously, we want to limit screen time, so we don't want them to, have too much screen time as well. But that's the one thing. Obviously, using a dictionary. So literally, if they do not spell a word correctly, go towards a dictionary and look up the word and rewrite it. When the kids are little, writing the words and actually putting a visual connotation to it. So if it's the word table, write out the word table and we stick it on the table. Every time we walk past the table, we see the word. So it's those visual connections. So it really depends on the root cause of it and the age of the child. And for parents to use good spelling. So type out a message to your child and use the correct spelling. When they're sending a message to you, ask them to type out the full word, so you can make it a game. But I think the big thing is, whatever you're doing, make it fun, because let's face it, practicing spelling is not fun. If I meet any adult that tells me practicing spelling is their best, they love it, then I have to be motivated to believe that. So it's always to make it a bit more fun. I think that's the main thing. Doing paired reading activities that you can literally Google paired reading. It's a specific technique that we use also to improve reading and spelling. So there's a lot of things available, but I think it depends on the age and the root cause.
Our daughter is 13, and she reads a lot. But I think when it comes to spelling, I don't know if it's like, maybe attention to detail or something. But the little boy, I think you can read more, and maybe that'll help. But I like your tips, and I think the other one about the dictionary, that's how we learned. I mean, that was old school.
Yeah.
That's what got drilled into us, because, the last thing you want to do is like go and look up this word again. So you just managed to get it right, because you didn't want to do it again. But I like those.
Yeah. So much has changed. I often say to parents, if they say to me, but we were in school and we were fine, why are our kids not coping? And then I go, but we were not in the same school as they are. We did not live in the same life that they live now. If you look at the curriculum, how much it's changed. I mean, by grade 1, you're already writing and learning the alphabet and everything. We literally learned that in grade 1. Maybe towards the end of the year, you were able to write words and sentences. But so it's changed. The curriculum has changed. The education sector has changed. Technology has changed. So they're also just dealing with a lot of different things. I spoke the other day about it. If I have to compare the amount of pressure that our kids are under, as opposed to the pressure we had, not that we didn't have challenges, we had lots, but I think they have different challenges now. And I really feel that they have more social media, and the pressure that they are living under. The labeling, the bullying is just way more extreme than what it used to be. It was always there, but I think cyberbullying and everything else that's coming up. So they're just dealing with so much more, which makes it a lot less inviting to sit and practice words with a dictionary, because there's a lot of other things, that's drawing their attention to it. And I think just in class, there's not that much time to kind of drill in these skills and to do it in a fun way. We have to get through the work and we have to get things done because we've got certain things that we have to tick off. So I think that in itself also causes, a lot of other pressures and maybe also opening up the door for some kids maybe needing concessions more, just because the whole package has changed so much.
Yeah, I love the fact that you mentioned that the package has changed, because again, like I say, I mean, most of my schooling was done in Zim. One of the biggest changes for me coming to South Africa was suddenly getting these midweek cycle tests. And, I grew up in you wrote 2 sets of exams. You wrote your mid-year exams and you wrote your end-of-year exams, and that was it. You were graded the rest of the year based on the work that you did in class and your homework, and suddenly you now had this random test that popped up in the middle of. So just on that, I mean, you get concessions for exams, but I mean, for your every Tuesday history cycle test or whichever subjects on, how would a person get, would a person still qualify for a concession on a cycle test, or would that be more of almost an internal agreement with the school that, Johnny needs an extra 20 minutes, so his cycle test is going to be written at break time kind of case? How would the schools or you as a psychologist recommend the schools handle a situation like that?
Like that, yeah. So internal accommodations are there and they can be done, but under very strict guidance. So the department is actually trying to stay quite clear from internal accommodations that hasn't been approved by them. Because at the end of, if you get to matric and you do not have a formal concession approved by the IEB, Cambridge, or the department, you cannot have it. And then you have caused a detriment to this child. Now this child's used to having extra time, but they will never have it in the end exam. So what's the point of it? Then they fail. So they've stayed clear from that. So we really motivate and say, get it approved by the department. Otherwise, in actual fact, you're not really allowed to have it. The emergency concessions are more the ones that they internally grant because it's an emergency. We really motivate and say, have it approved. To answer your question on the exams, so we will obviously get the new guidance for the new academic calendar, and then I'll be able to comment more on that. But it changes. So they try to keep it consistent, but at this point, you have concessions for term 2 and term 4 when you have your formal exams. For the cycle test term 1 and term 3, there used to be concessions. So you used to also get your concessions for term 1 and term 3 for the cycle test. We'll obviously now, in the new calendar year, get the new policies because they update it yearly or every second year. So then we'll see what happens. But yes, the ideal is that we have in term 1 and term 3 with a cycle test, and also in term 2 and term 4 when there's formal exams. But for your general class tests, no, you don't get concessions for that. You also don't get concessions for your work in class. The reason for that is that there's no time to have extra time and all the concessions in a normal school week. if that makes sense. If every child had to get extra time in class, they'll be there till 7 o'clock at night. So that's the one thing. It's just practically, it's impossible. The second thing, which is probably the most important one, that should be point number one, is that we are trying to intervene. We are trying to teach these kids to work faster. We are trying to develop their motor skills. We are trying to develop their processing. So it gives them the intervention needed. But then when it comes to exam times, to help them to not fail and to actually, utilize their knowledge and their potential, that's when the concession comes into play. So that's kind of like the background of the concessions.
So Leanda, just one point stuck with me, and that's my last question, and then we'll ask Shaz for her closing thoughts as well. But you mentioned that there's probably more concessions now, and you mentioned that there might be some thoughts around that. Can you just take us through that a little bit more? I mean, is it similar to like ADHD? It seems to be a lot more prevalent now. And I don't know if it's just society's awareness of it or if it was always there, like I mentioned with my friend, growing up. But do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I think on the one side, yes, we are definitely more aware. We're creating more awareness. We're teaching kids to speak up. We are seeing that mental health is more important now and the kids are more open to it. I mean, the kids love coming for therapy and they have absolutely no problem telling all their friends that they are in therapy. I'm going to therapy, where sometimes it's more the stigma in society and parents that say, okay, you don't have to tell everyone. And then I go, why? Why not? It's helping me. So I think that's the one thing, is that, yes, we're becoming more aware of it, which is positive and great. But I think things are also being overdiagnosed, because about 10 to 20% of kids that are labeled ADHD are actually, justifiable, diagnosable with ADHD, because that's why also these assessments are so important. So the same assessments we do for concessions are the same assessments that we are supposed to do for diagnosing a learning difficulty or a learning disorder or ADHD or autism or whatever the case might be. So we do a full range assessment, because at the end of the day, we need to be sure that this is actually the diagnosis. Because ADHD, for example, the symptoms and the signs of ADHD is very similar to anxiety and trauma and learning difficulties. So, we see these symptoms and we diagnose and we say, go get medication. And then the medication gets a bad name for it because the child didn't need it in the first place. So, I'm a firm believer there's a time and a place for everything, and medication has changed lives. But I really think that we're over-diagnosing, over-medicating, and that's why these assessments are also so important. So yes, it's becoming more prominent, and we are accepting it more and be more educated. But at the same time, I think there's an overdiagnosis, and that's why the assessments are important. Other thoughts, like I mentioned, my thoughts around why it's becoming more, the talk of the town, like we said, or it's becoming more, people are asking for it more, is that they are educated now. But at the same time, our kids are having more challenges. I mean, COVID in itself, there's so many kids that have developed anxiety difficulties, that have developed learning difficulties due to the impacts of COVID not being in school and just the stress around it. So I think, we'll be 10 years, 20 years down the line, we'll still be talking about the pandemic. But even if that subsides, in general, our kids are really coping in a home where parents are working. There's a lot less time to spend with our kids. So talk for another day. I mean, but those things are definitely things that our kids battle with. And all of these factors combined, especially in South Africa, where we speak so many beautiful languages, but our kids are then schooled in English, and then it's their fourth or their fifth or their sixth language, that causes learning difficulties. So, which also validates a concession. So I think in general, it's a very holistic answer to say that all the different areas that's in a child's life could be an answer to why we are seeing more concessions at the moment.
I like that. I think it was a few months back, and I was driving my little boy to school, and I saw him with his face shield on, and I thought, this is actually so weird, eh? But I can't remember a time when he asked me, do I need to wear my face shield? And it's interesting, like, what you said about, how we just used to it and how they just used to it. But it is a weird world, and I think Shaz touched on this really nicely when she spoke about the cycle test, which I probably didn't think about it before. But I was used to it as well. Just 2 exams. It was June and it was November, and you almost got psyched up for that. And there were like some tests maybe in between. But every week, if the child has to be almost anxious about this test that they're doing, so they're constantly in the state of anxiety, and I can't think that that's good as well. But there's obviously reasons for that, in terms of how the education system is. But I think it's a deeper topic. But it's interesting, hearing from you as a professional as well, to see the increase in concessions, the increase in ADHD, which I also suspected and which you collaborated on. I like your point about therapy and kids, because, last week when we had the occupational therapist who specializes in mental illness and health in the workplace, and I said, if we get to a stage in the workplace where someone can say, I actually have a therapy session on Thursday at 10 o'clock and I can't make that meeting, then I think as a society we've worked, be positive. But until that happens, and I've never seen it at any of the workplaces I've been at, where people have the confidence to be able to say that. But it's interesting hearing you say with kids how comfortable they are with it. So maybe there's hope over time.
Definitely. I think they're the next generation, and if they can advocate for us, then I think we're going to have a way healthier society on our hands in the future. So I'm excited about that.
Agreed. Yeah. So Shaz, on your side, closing thoughts for Leanda?
Look, I think we've covered some really, really great aspects, and we've also given people a lot of tangible things that they can start looking for. Just from my side, I do think that you're right. Some stuff is very much just overdiagnosed, because it's just easier to say, okay, ADHD, than to go and look for something else. With that being said, I do think it is important for parents, if they suspect something, go and get an assessment. Don't wait for the school to first say, maybe you should get an assessment. Because, like you said earlier, if you are leaving this until too late, the child is already in a backlog. Then I did have one question, which I don't know if it does fit into this, but I've been watching a series called Atypical, which is about a high-functioning autistic boy. But he has massive auditory processing. Are you finding it more regularly that schools are allowing kids to wear kind of headsets so that they can block out noise? I can imagine with 45 children in a classroom, somebody with auditory processing issues would have a problem.
Definitely, and sensory integration as well. So, like I said, in your mainstream schools, we are really advocating that, but in your remedial streams, that's really something that they specialize in. So we'll often find kids that sit with your headsets, but then it's not headsets that play music. Then it's your sound kind of blocking headsets, the little ones are so cute. They come with their little ear muffs, that you wear in winter. So yes, we definitely are seeing. And in any mainstream school, remember, we follow an inclusive education system in South Africa. So we motivate and we say, if the child can cope in mainstream setting, we don't want to move them. But if it is the best for the child to move into a remedial setting that also does mainstream curriculum, but they do it differently, or they do it, with a different teaching method or whatever, and the accommodations are more, but definitely. So I'm seeing desk stands, and we're seeing sitting on yoga balls, and we're seeing having a band around your chair. We're seeing having certain textured paper underneath your table that you can fiddle with. So we're seeing these accommodations, and it's so amazing to walk into this class and everyone's focused, but everyone's busy. So it's organized, the teachers say it's organized chaos. Please don't think it's chaos, it's organized. So I think we're definitely seeing more and more of it. And it's a very strange thing to get someone to wrap their head around. How can you sit and fiddle and focus? Well, that's actually how we divert the energy to be able to focus cognitively, so we are, and we educate teachers. I think that's something that I also love doing, is just actually assisting teachers to see that it's not going to be a burden for them. It's not not supposed to cause challenges. It's supposed to facilitate a healthy environment where the kids can learn. So definitely seeing more of that, and very pro internal classroom concessions like that, yes.
Okay, so then my last question, do they still do a pen license?
They do. And that is the most amazing, I must say. Some kids hate it, some kids love it. So with the handwriting concession, very quick, is that when you're doing handwriting concessions, you can actually apply for not to write in cursive when you go to grade 4 upwards, or print. So that's also one of them. But yes, the kids are very excited about their pen licenses. So I think that's the next best thing to slice bread and having your actual license. It's that's their highlight.
That's amazing. I mean, like you mentioned cursive as well, but I remember in school, I mean, there were some teachers that almost like forced you to write cursive, and others, that were pretty relaxed about, print or cursive. But I think it got to a certain standard or grade where I just, cursive just didn't make any sense. Until you hit grade 12, and then there was the English teacher that said, actually, it has to be cursive. So now you have to learn that stuff again. But Leanda, I really enjoyed this. I mean, we really enjoyed it. And I think we learned a lot again. I mean, I didn't think concessions was such a detailed topic, but obviously it is. And it, gives us a good sense of, what a wealth of information that's missing. Not just from us, but I think from a mainstream, parent education perspective, even children. Is there anything we should have asked you around this amazing topic that we didn't, and that you probably think, someone listening to this would probably benefit from?
I think we covered all bases. I think the only key thing that we can really take from this, from my side, or something that I want to leave with parents or whoever is listening to the topic, is that it shouldn't be a negative connotation. It shouldn't be something that you say, oh, I don't want my child to have this because what are they going to be made fun of, etc. I can leave you with a beautiful story of having a grade 11 boy who was never diagnosed with ADHD. He's got severe ADHD. He is extremely intelligent, superior functioning, but failed. He failed his subjects. After being assessed, so they referred for concessions, being assessed, diagnosed with ADHD, he needed medication, so on his correct stuff that he's supposed to be using medically, and he's getting distinction. So, and seeing that, and seeing a child that was depressed, anxious, couldn't learn, couldn't achieve, by having a concession application done and approved, with obviously all the other interventions, but how a concession can change your life. So I think that's a positive note and something to leave parents with, to say, I always say that's my end off to almost any advice I can give, is rather be the parent that looks back and says, I'm glad I did something. My child, today can do what he does, or, they are where they are because I made that decision, and not be the parent that looks back and say, oh, I wish I did something. I wish I just did it anyway. So I think that's the key kind of thing that we need to keep in mind, is to always look back and go, I'm glad I did.
I love that. I love that saying. I love that story. And I think, I think every parent wants to do the best for their children. And I think, what you just said is another reason why they should pay more attention, to this. And also, these are all like, tools of the trade almost, like the tips and tricks, and, and you need to know when to use it, and, the fact that it's even there. And I think what you just showed us is, and told us in many ways about how you could approach this. And I think what Shaz said earlier, you just have to be aware, and you have to see that it's happening. And if you are, I think then you can reach out to amazing people like yourself and say, okay, how can you help me? And I think, or help my child. And I think that would be amazing. So thanks very much for your time. We really, really enjoyed this. And I think I want to close off by saying, you mentioned about the remedial school. And I think that's such a prevalent topic. So I think, when Shaz can, and, your diary willing, we would love to take that topic and look at that. More talking about, from why would a child choose a remedial setting, and what can remedial schools actually offer? Because I think there's a space for that. And, it's amazing hearing you, talk about how we can almost accommodate these things.
Definitely. And thanks for having me. I think it's amazing that you guys have this platform. It's awesome to educate parents and teachers and just make people aware. It's exciting. We love what we do, and thank you for providing this platform.
Thank you very much for joining us today.
Only a pleasure.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening. As always, stay tuned and we'll speak to you in the next episode.